Hello.
And welcome to our Thought Lab, the first one of 2023. So good to have you all here. As you're all slowly coming in, do check in. Where in the world are you right now? Where are you connecting from? In a few moments, we'll start it off and let's zoom in a little bit. What's happening here?
Every time one of us clicks the card, it will start over. So, FYI.
All right. I'm going to put myself just over in the Netherlands. Where is everybody else connecting from? All right.
Very European-centric here.
Yeah, so it seems. All right, and of course, you can always use the chat as well. Just click C and you can open up the chat. Kohav Cohen joining us from Israel, and Anne-Maria is, of course, in Amsterdam. David, one of our presenters today, is connecting from Münster in Germany, and I reckon that his partner Klara is very nearby.
Roughly 3 meters.
Roughly 3 meters. Okay. We have Gabriella connecting from Romania, Miriam from Düsseldorf, Alessandra from Germany, Sina is in Vienna, Maya is in Krakow, Ines in Portugal, Corina is in Berlin, Luisa in Bochum. That's not too far away from Amsterdam as well. It's halfway there. Ina, Brussels, Eva, Serbia, Srpsko. Chris is in Rotterdam, and Yael is in Jerusalem. All right, I'm connecting just a little outside of Amsterdam. You could say Amsterdam, or Utrecht, or it's somewhere in between. I think we got quite a few people there then, and by the looks of it, there's nobody in the waiting room right now. So without further ado, I would again like to welcome you all to this Thought Lab, the first one of 2023. We're going to blast off here with a wonderful session together with Klara and David, who are from Educated. And at this point, I would thank you so much to both of you for starting off the year with this wonderful session that we'll be having. We are so much looking forward to learning from you, and with this, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. I think we're all super curious to get to know all of you a bit more, but to make sure that we make best use of the time, I think we'll jump right in. Maybe, David, we can quickly introduce ourselves before we start with a little input session first, because I think to start working on more practical stuff, we want to give you a quick overview of what we're actually dealing with today, which is skills, of course. So what are skills? Why do you even need them in the first place? We will then jump into a practice session for about 15 minutes, then talk a little bit more about skill profiles as a specific use case, then do another practice session. And if any of you have leftover questions, we can do that in the end. So that as a rough overview, maybe David, you quickly want to introduce yourself.
Yes, sure. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our workshop. Really looking forward. Also for us, the first workshop this year. So we are really hyped to work together with you on this exciting topic here today. So my name is David. I'm one of the co-founders and managing directors of Educated. We are an educational technology company based in Münster here in Germany, also with a small office in Berlin, where we work with multiple clients of different sizes on their skills-based transformation, and in particular in the learning and development space. So we are really excited to work with you on this topic. Originally, I'm not coming from a typical learning background. I'm more a techie, I would say. So started actually data scientist many years ago, and then slowly transferred from machine learning into more the human learning part, or at least connecting both sides of it. Yeah, handing over to Klara for her introduction.
Yes, nice to meet you. So I'm Klara. I'm a psychologist from my educational background, and at Educated, I'm responsible for our own skill infrastructure and skill framework. And I often work with international clients to help them set up their skill infrastructure. So I'm very excited today to talk about this topic a bit more and what skills are, why we need them, and how we can set them up in the first place. So David, let's get started. Why do we need skills?
Yes, thanks so much, Klara. So we get started with a brief introduction here. So 10 minutes or so of a little bit of input on recent trends and what we are currently seeing in the L&D space when it comes to skills. And we'd like to share a few thoughts here first with you before we dive into our Miro board right after that. So we called this the skill workshop. And indeed, this word skills is, if you read a little bit the news and blog posts and follow a few people in the scene right now, it's all over the place, right? So we are seeing, I would almost say, even the big consultancies jumping on the train, talking about skills assessment, about moving from jobs to skills and all these sorts of things. And that's usually a sign to explore the space a bit further. And indeed, there are many interesting things to explore and many interesting things. Of course, skills have already been present for years, maybe even decades in the L&D space. But there are a few things that are now different. In particular, we have now a bit more technology, we have a bit more understanding, we have a bit more integrations power, we have platforms for skills, which makes it really worth to talk a little bit about what the skill transformation actually means for L&D. And this is what we are also in our day-to-day jobs are working on with many different companies and many different teams. So we'd like to share a little bit about this today. And when we are talking about skills, it's usually worth to go one step back and look at all those kind of things we in the L&D space have been doing, hopefully in a good way already for many years. And indeed, when we are talking to L&D teams today, we see that training requirement analysis is not a new thing anymore. Many people have analyzed their training requirements or at least know how to do it. Many teams already have bought an LMS system or some sort of system to manage the training. Indeed, many have also bought huge content libraries. So we are not living in a world anymore where content is really super hard to find, at least for the major topics. And we see many clients who actually have thousands of courses in their learning management system. And of course, learning culture is also not a new topic anymore. And many are doing a really great job with several initiatives contributing to learning culture. Nevertheless, if we walk through the different stands on huge learning technology fairs and talk to L&D teams, usually it's not really that people are smiling all over the face and saying, we have fixed it, we are done, we really have solved L&D. And still we are seeing some sort of questions, in particular from learners, that remain unanswered in this world where we have analyzed the training requirements, in this world where we have an LMS, where we have lots of content, and where we might even have a learning culture or a good one. And these are kind of the question we are continuously facing here in many L&D teams. First one is really the question that the learner has, where do we actually want to go? So they are often missing some sort of guidance how their own future skill profiles might look like. So what's actually the direction, the goal where I'm heading here? The second question that remains often unanswered in this pure, let's say, content delivery mode is, where am I standing today? So even if I have the same goal as my colleague, I might start from very different positions. And indeed, the heterogeneity of learners actually increased so much in recent years through new skills, new jobs, and so on, that the individual needs are really important to consider here. And final question, often even in the most effective bridge, the most effective learning journey on their way. And this pure lots of content that has been created is in particular in the pure e-learning world for many a bit boring, or at least not really effective. And now, where do skills now come into play here? And one of our favorite metaphors that we keep using is to look just, first of all, just at the question. Now, forget everything that I just mentioned and told you. Just look at the questions. Where do we want to go? Where do we stand today? And how do I get there? And think about a system that we all are using on an almost daily basis that answers those questions. It's a navigation system, right? Could be Google Maps or another sort of navigation system. And what we are really building with skills is kind of a navigation system, and a similar revolution that has happened to navigation systems compared to paper maps is actually happening in the learning space. So a few years ago, like 20 or so, we had a digital mapping revolution where you can now zoom in flexibly and have lots of ways to discover your goals. We had a positioning revolution with GPS. Now you're able to really locate yourself up to a few meters accurate. And we had a navigation revolution where you can choose your modes of transport and decide whether you want to go by feet or with a train and so on. And a very similar one are we now experiencing with skills-based learning and development, where our job is actually to build a navigation system just based on skills. And if we break this down, this idea of a navigation system for our learners, for skills in general, we can also break it down again in almost exactly the 3 steps that have happened to the traditional navigation systems like Google Maps. In particular, we have a skill mapping, and I'll tell a little bit more about this in a minute, a skill mapping revolution. So where we basically create the skill map, first of all, and that's what we are planning to do with you today as well, at least in the very first stage. Then we have a positioning revolution, where new systems that we can use help us to assess our own knowledge and the knowledge of our learners to make really accurately informed decision, also for personalization. And ultimately, once we know where our learners stand and where they are positioned, and if we know what the map is, we can build a navigation system and provide really tailored learning journeys and recommendations up to the level of really adaptive learning experiences, right? So these are kind of the 3 things that are majorly effective when thinking about skills and when thinking about the skills-based transformation. And what this means, I will outline this now in the next 1 or 2 minutes. So zooming into each of these blocks real quick. We don't have too much time today. Probably I can talk for an hour about each of these main pillars, but I try to at least give you the brief idea of what's in skill mapping, skill positioning, and skill navigation. First one, skill mapping. So usually we, when clients start working with skills and companies start working with skills, they start with creating their so-called skill map, how we call it. Sometimes they also have different names, but usually the skill map consists of 2 main blocks, main things you're talking about. The first one is your skills taxonomy, so unified language for skills. It's basically, sometimes we say it's your kind of Lego box defining the little bricks you later want to use to build your figures, your profiles. There are many different skill taxonomies. You might know this on the market that you can also buy out of the box. You can create your own one, and you can really, and I mean this literally, start with pen and paper to create your first version of the skills taxonomy. It sounds always a bit, I think some clients, one day mentioned, it sounds like a term from medicine, but it's actually not that scary. You can start with really a shallow level of skills and thinking about what kind of universal skills do you have in your company, like Microsoft Excel or so, and maybe break those skills further down into lower levels. We will tell you a bit more about this later in the workshop. And then once you have defined your taxonomy and the different levels of skills that you need and decided actually how granular you want to go, you can use this to build your skill profiles. So kind of giving learners orientation of where they want to go and answering this very first question that I just mentioned. Then we have positioning. Don't want to dive too deep into this space because again, it's quite huge. But basic positioning means that you now use your skill taxonomy and the profiles to kind of build assessments for learners, first of all for themselves, so that they know where they stand, and later we can do recommendations based on this. And also it has a value in itself often to reflect on your skills in terms of your profile. But of course, it can also be used for skill insights on the organization level, and it is really, really powerful. In fact, we have many actually organizations, and we're seeing many organizations just moving to a skills-based approach for workforce planning on a really high-level insights level. And ultimately, you can do the skill navigation, where you basically take your target profile, here, for example, data literate, where you take your current profile, you calculate kind of the gaps in between, and then map also your entire learning portfolio, or at least a part of it, to individual skills, so that via this matching logic, you can actually say, hey, this learning journey is well suited to bridge this specific gap between your current position and your target, kind of. So I talked a lot about skills already. Now handing a little quickly over to Klara here, who will tell us a bit more about what do we actually mean with the skill.
Yeah, so we just don't want to dive too deep into this topic, but we just want to give you a quick comparison. What's the difference between skills and competencies? Because a lot of you might already have competencies within your organization, because competency models or competency matrices or whatever are a quite common instrument in L&D. So you might use it for performance assessments, for example, and so on. And so the two concepts are a bit similar. So it kind of, the question is usually coming up, okay, is this the same thing? Can I just use my competencies as skills? And the terms are used a bit differently throughout the industry. You might have experienced this yourself. So there's no universal answer to this, but from what I've seen previously in different companies is that the terms are used slightly differently. So competencies are usually on a bit more higher level. So they are more focused on broad topics, like, for example, leadership or innovation or something like that. That might be, or for example, driving innovation might be a typical competency. Depending on the model that you use at your company, they are usually more broad and behavior-based. So they outline a behavior that you want to see. So for example, it could be something like drives innovation or innovative methods within his or her team. So that could be a typical behavior that describes the competency. And this is usually used for qualitative assessments, which are, for example, done by observation or in interviews, or for example, by the manager. Skills, on the other hand, are a bit more universal. So you don't just use them for qualitative assessments, but you can use them for many different things that we will actually take a look at in a second. And they are usually a bit more granular. So you might start at a very high level, like leadership or innovation, but you can go much more granular in different steps. And this helps us to then later make more detailed recommendations to learners, for example, and also to do maybe more accurate tests or assessments on these skills. So it's not the same thing. You can use both. Just to give you a quick overview of that, I hope this helps to kind of put this into perspective with regards to competencies. So I've already touched on there are different use cases. Skills are, as David already said, basically the universal language across all kinds of different initiatives you might have within your HR or L&D area. So we've outlined a few here, like recruiting and hiring, onboarding, learning, strategic workforce planning, for example, and so on. So these are all use cases where you could technically use skills. And then the skills really help to kind of unify the language across all these use cases. So it's not silos anymore. It's not like every single team does their own thing, but you can use skills across all of these initiatives to make it more consistent across the company. So that's the general idea of how you can use skills. And since we've already touched on use cases, that's what we want to dive into for a first working session with you. Because defining the use case for your skills is really the first step if you want to get started and set up maybe a skills-based framework at your organization. So we are really curious of what your use cases could be at your company and what you maybe see as challenges of implementing skills in any of these use cases. So we've prepared a mirror board. Let me try to share this here with you. All right. Can you see a mirror board and access it? I think that's looking good. Perfect. So we will start with the brainstorming on the left side. So we have two fields here that you should see when you join the Miro board. So you can take any of the post-its. I would say we use about 4 minutes for each of you to just collect your thoughts on, first of all, what are potential use cases for skills at your organization that you see? And then secondly, what obstacles do you see when you would implement these skills? So what could be problems? Do you anticipate anything that could go wrong with implementing skills at your company and so on? So feel free to get going, grab the post-it, and I would say until 12:59 maybe. And then we can quickly discuss. Thank you so much for the active contribution. I see loads of post-its here and actually already had to increase the size of the box because you had so many ideas. So I'll just quickly summarize from what we're already seeing here in this box. I think we can also try to consolidate everything and make it available afterwards. I guess that's possible also to make it available to the group. So we will structure it a bit more nicely. And then send it over to you. So on the use cases side, I think the most frequently mentioned one is at the bottom left. We've already tried to cluster it a bit, which is related to career paths, career development, job levels, and promotion processes. So yeah, this is a very frequent use case because, of course, with skills, you can, as David already mentioned, model quite well the requirements for certain roles or the goals. And of course, you can use that for career planning, career succession, and create transparency for your learners. We also see quite a few different ones, like, for example, a mentoring program, which sounds very interesting, internal mobility, definitely, awareness of seniority and levels. We also see performance management, yes, of course, which still is a very typical case. Project teams composition, yes, of course, because you don't just have to work job-based, but you can actually define, for example, skill requirements for a certain project team, and maybe even try to find people within your organization who have the fitting skills. So a lot of different ideas. As I said, we will try to cluster this and structure it afterwards, so you also have access to all these ideas from the group. On the obstacle side, we have actually a lot of different obstacles that you could foresee here. So I saw a few ones that mention how consistent are actually the skills, or that you might get in trouble if you have too many skills in your organization, or that it might even be difficult to create all of the skills that are necessary in your organization. That is definitely true. There are cases that organizations create so many skills that it's difficult to oversee. Of course, you can try to set up a process that makes it easier to structure. And usually you would also not start with setting up your skills for the whole organization. But usually, at least what we see often and what we would recommend is to start with a piloting area. So choose one specific functional area where you start with setting up the skills. You can set up a process, you can get feedback for this process, and revise it, and then extend it much more into other areas when you've tested the process a bit. So that at least can help limit the troubles there a bit.
It's actually a really, really good collection here on the obstacle side of things and questions that you usually want to address in such a project where you usually look at these very different dimensions. And most of those questions usually arise in this very first step that we just discussed, the skill mapping step, and in particular in the skill taxonomy step, where you think about what's the right level, which also ultimately determines the effort. I'm seeing a few people being worried a little bit about the effort, in particular for small organizations. Of course, it's a really important and powerful question, and it also depends a bit later on the use cases. For example, what we are seeing in practice is that the level needed, for example, for adaptive learning experiences. So if you want to really micro-personalize your learning content is of course much higher than, for example, just using it as general guidance for the organization, or sometimes also internal mobility use cases can be facilitated a little bit on a higher level. That's less effort. I would love to dive more into detail, but I'm already seeing Klara's face, who has to watch the time here. So, Klara, sorry.
Yes, time watcher today. Obviously, super interesting topic. Let's move on. Unfortunately, I'd love to discuss this even more, but I have a second part of the session, which is to dive a bit deeper into skill profiles. David already mentioned the concept just now. I will quickly share my screen again to give you just a quick overview of what skill profiles are and how they are structured, because then we can jump into a second quick working session where you can set up your very own first skill profile, just very hands-on, try it out to see how it works. So let's see if I can share my screen. All right. Can you see it?
Yes, that works.
Perfect. Yes, so let's take a bit of a closer look at skill profiles. So here again, a quick reminder how the skill navigation process works. So we have skill mapping, which is building your digital roadmap of skills. Skill positioning is finding out where you stand today, and navigation is how do I get to where I want from where I am today in the fastest and most efficient way. And with skill profiles, we're still in the very first step, which is skill mapping. We already talked quickly about a skill taxonomy. So the taxonomy is the big Lego box with all the skills within your company or your organization. And from the skill taxonomy, you can now build your skill profile. And the profile is your goal. This is the collection of skills that you want someone to reach, or that's the goal for someone to have this number of skills. So let me just show you an example. I think before describing it, it makes sense to just look at an example and how this could look like. So this is an exemplary skill profile. It doesn't have to always be this format. We just chose this to make it easier to understand for you. And on the right side here, you can see basically the heart of the skill profile, because this is the collection of skills. So a profile consists of a set of skills that we take from the taxonomy that's relevant for a certain goal or a certain role. In this case, we call our skill profile data translator. So it's a data-driven role, basically, to kind of work with data and translate it to other areas of the company. There's no need to look at the individual skills right now, but I rather want you to look at the structure. So at the top here, in these dark gray boxes, these are more higher level skills. You could also call them categories, for example. And this really helps us to organize the skills a bit, because if you just use a big collection of skills with no structure at all, it's usually very hard to understand at first glance. So we have kind of categories, like for example, in this case would be data security, data modeling, and so on. So these are the buckets, basically. And then within each bucket, you have a few more like lower level skills that belong to this high level skill. So for example, with data visualization, you can break this down into smaller bricks, right? So for example, you learn about different types of visualization, you learn about some design principles and design thinking, and all of this belongs to the category. So this is how we would structure a skill profile. We have the categories at top, the skills that belong to it that we take from the general taxonomy. It's also usually helpful for the profile to have a name and maybe a description, because if you later assign it to learners or you give it to people, it's just helpful to understand what this profile is actually about. And then again, last note, it does not have to look like this exactly visually. You can, for example, create a skill profile in a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet or in a Miro board, which is what we'll do in a second. So summarizing, these are kind of usually the parts that a skill profile has. So it usually has a title. You have the skills that belong in the profile that you take from the taxonomy. You usually have some categories at the top that help you structuring your skills and makes it easier to understand. And then you often have a description or a goal related to the profile. So this is the fast version of how a skill profile looks like. What can you use it for? So to take a bit more practical look at this, you can use this, for example, for learning recommendations, because if someone has a skill profile and they assess themselves on it, maybe, so they take a look at the skills and make an assessment how good they are on each skill. You can then make learning recommendations based on the skills where they still have gaps. You can also use it to model job requirements. So you can take one skill profile for a certain job and create it, and then make it very transparent which skills are required for a certain job. You can also, I think someone of you also suggested this, help people find internal growth opportunities, so basically internal mobility case, by finding profiles that match their own skills. And of course, you can also use it to, for example, report on business goals, because when you have the results of individual people from their skill profiles, you can aggregate this to have organization-wide reporting. So this just to illustrate what you can use skill profiles for. There are more use cases. This is just a quick extract. And from our experience, there are 3 things to really take care of when you're building skill profiles. First of all, make sure that you have a clear overview. So it should be really easy to understand. Anyone who looks at it should immediately see, okay, what does this mean? And the language should be clear to the people, to also improve acceptance, for example, among learners. Then you have to determine the right level of granularity for your skills. So how big are your skills? And this really depends on the use case that you want to do later with your skill profiles. And then the last point is prioritization, because when you start brainstorming which skills are relevant for a certain role, you can go on endlessly. So you will always find more skills that could potentially be helpful at some point. And to increase focus, it really helps to just prioritize quite strongly and say, okay, these are the skills that are really essential, and the rest might be nice to have, but maybe they shouldn't be part of the skill profile right now, to help people focus on the most important things. So this is just a quick overview of what a skill profile can look like. And now I would suggest that we start building some skill profiles. So let's jump into our Miro board again. There we go. And we will move to the second exercise, which is a bit more on the right. So you see a template there that we inserted, and this is just, it's basically like a little spreadsheet. And at the top of each kind of template, you see in dark blue the categories. So these are the higher level skills. For example, I just created a fictional one here, right? So this, for example, includes skills like project management, design thinking, e-learning, time management, and so on. And below that, you see the parts that belong to it. So below are the smaller skills that belong to the one at the top. So for e-learning, for example, you might have formats, you might have LMS and LXP systems, you might learn about data and analytics regarding e-learning and so on. So please take this fictional profile and use it as a template. You can just simply copy this template here and then create your own skill profile. And I would recommend for you to take your own role. So all of you have some kind of role in your organization, and usually you know that quite well. So I'd recommend to take your own role, take, I'd say 5 minutes, and just brainstorm the skills that would belong in your skill profile. Awesome, the time is up. Thank you so much for working on your skill profiles. I've seen some really, really great results. And actually, we knew that the time was a bit short, so we weren't sure what to expect when throwing you into these templates. But yeah, kudos to you. Actually, a lot of these look pretty great. I'd say maybe let's take a quick look at 1 or 2 examples. I don't want to like pick anyone out here. I would just suggest that I zoom in into 1 or 2 of them and quickly have a first kind of reaction to it. So maybe firstly, let's look at the one at the bottom left. I'll try to bring all of you to where I am. I hope that worked. So yes, I think that's working. So this looks quite comprehensive already with a lot of skills. So kudos, I think this looks very well structured. And here again at the top we have the categories. So I see, for example, learning consultancy, I see knowledge curation, key accounting. All of that seems like it makes a lot of sense. And then maybe let's take a look at the few more granular skills that we see below. So for example, we have under learning consultancy, we have performance consulting, active listening, curiosity. So I guess curiosity might be a bit of a controversial one. That really depends who you're talking to, but of course curiosity might be seen as more or less of a skill, or it could be more like a personality trait. But still, in my view, it could be in there. It probably just depends on who you talk to, whether that would be defined as a skill or not. Under the different other skills, we have, for example, prioritization, under time management. That seems like it makes a lot of sense. Under knowledge curation, we have Confluence as a tool. So that definitely makes a lot of sense. You should also include your tools as skills. What we sometimes do with tools is actually create them as their own skill. So for example, in this case, you have Confluence under knowledge curation. And what you could also do is make Confluence its own like higher level skill and put everything that belongs to Confluence under that. And whether that makes sense or not depends mainly on how much stuff you have in this topic. If it's just a brief overview, keep it under something else. If you really want, if that's something you need very comprehensive knowledge on Confluence, you might take it as its own skill, for example.
We're actually also seeing one other really interesting thing. If you look at the very bottom left, there's communication. And if you look at the very top right, there's also communication. So we actually have one sticky note belonging to two categories here. So that's also a really interesting trade-off that many of the teams we're working with often have. Are those actually two different skills now? So is there one key accounting communication skill that works fundamentally different to the project management communication skill? Or is it the same? So is my skill taxonomy that we are actually creating here on a really small level, is it strictly hierarchical, where you can just have one kind of parent category? Or is it a bit more, let's say, ambiguous? So also a design decision for a taxonomy. Depending on the use cases, again, different decisions here could make sense. But we're seeing lots of really interesting things here. And of course, for every single of these little light blue boxes and sticky notes here, you could dive into a lot more detail going forward. So in fact, we have many clients who would then, for example, take articulate rise and the skill belonging to this one and would break it down maybe into 50 sub-skills even to learn about the different modules and functionalities here. But really great example. It's impressive what you came up with here in just 5 or 7 minutes.
And quick note on the communication example you gave, because I think this is quite a common struggle that people have when they set up skill taxonomies, is that all of a sudden you have skills coming up at different corners. So you have communication within several different skills. And as David already said, there are different ways of solving this. One way that I think is very typical and that we use a lot is if you find a skill kind of belongs to two categories, it's probably its own separate category altogether. Because of course like each column that you have in here doesn't have to be a process, for example, but it's a logical skill. And so, for example, you can say communication is its own skill altogether. And of course, it's needed for key accounting and it's needed for project management. It's actually also needed for customer centricity, probably. But it doesn't have to be included in these strict skills, but it's its own skill and own column in this case. So that could be a way of dealing with it, just as a quick note. So thank you so much. I would say we can open up for Q&A for a Q&A session. So handing over to you, do you have anything that you want to ask us? It could be regarding this exercise and the skill profiles, but it could also be anything else that we talked about before. So we're really curious to answer your questions. Oh, I see there's already someone in the queue.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, David and Klara. My name is Orshi, and I work in HR consultancy. And I've been working a lot on building, for example, job matrices and all of these things where skills come in very handy. What I have been experiencing is that an exercise like this pretty much drives all of the leaders of departments crazy, because it's not, they don't really have the bandwidth to think about stuff like this, or that communication can be, you know, a main skill, but also like a sub skill to another skill. It's something that becomes very confusing to them. So when you're dealing with your implementation of this skill mapping, how do you respond to this? Do you, for example, attach questions to define, you know, each skill area, like what makes, or like criteria, what makes a skill a main skill, what makes a certain skill a sub skill? I would love to hear your solution in this. Thanks.
Klara, do you want to answer, or should I?
Yeah, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, very great question. And actually, we experienced the same when we started in this field. Exactly the same experience. There are many different perspectives on this question. So our approach in general is to, within the organization, enable a core team of, however you want to call it, skill architects, or maybe the admins of the skill taxonomy, usually from the HR and learning space, to have the bandwidth and know about the different levels and how you would define them and so on. So that's the core team that we enable and work together with this team. And then we use the subject matter experts. So the different people for whom we actually build the profiles for workshops like these ones that we did today, a bit more extensive, usually a bit more detailed. We have a bit more time then to give briefing on what the levels are supposed to be. We have time to give more examples, but nevertheless, the output of those workshops are usually still some inconsistencies in terms of levels, and the sticky notes usually sometimes don't belong together and so on. So what we usually do is then to take the results from those workshops back into the core working group, who come up with a refined proposal and kind of own the central architecture of skills. That's then maybe for final validation sent back to the subject matter experts again. So kind of we only use those workshops not to come up with final skill profiles, with a final skill taxonomy, but just to get a lot of input and brainstorming and so on, and then always have a central governance unit kind of maintaining the overall quality and levels of detail on the skill taxonomy. Hope this answers the question kind of.
Yeah, thanks. It does, in a way. I mean, it's kind of stakeholder involvement on a higher level, as far as I understand it. Thanks.
Yeah, and really, it's a lot about enabling a core team to really keep the whole taxonomy consistent. That's usually a crucial puzzle piece. Here, you can of course improve the outcome of workshops with better briefings, but ultimately, it really makes sense to have internally one of two people who really know how to work with the different levels and taxonomies.
I think we have another question in the chat, which is, can we talk about or show an example of skill measurements?
Oh, great question. Yeah.
So there are, of course, like many different ways to assess or measure skills. I think we don't have time to go through all of them. So the most common ones that we see is, first of all, you can decide on who should assess. So it could be the learner themselves who assess themselves, so it's typical self-assessment, or it could be someone else, like typically that would be the manager, for example, assessing the learner. So this is like the two different sources of the assessment. And then, for example, you could do an assessment on a rating scale. So if you have a higher level skill like leadership, or what did we see before, project management, you can say, I think this is very typical, like out of 5 points, how many do you have? Like I'm a 3 out of 5 in project management, or a 2 out of 5 or whatever. So that's one option. Or you could do a test. That doesn't work for every topic, but especially for hard skills like software, for example, or so on. You could actually do a quiz, test, however you want to call it. So that's obviously a bit more objective and verified. And then what's also possible is if you go on a more granular level of skills, so smaller pieces, you could do a binary assessment. So ask these people, do you know about yes, no. And this only works for very granular skills, but I can give you an example. If we talk about, for example, PowerPoint, you could ask someone, do you know how to add an image on a slide in Microsoft PowerPoint? And then they can say yes or no. Obviously, that requires a lot more granular level, but you can actually create skills on this level. So that would be adding images in PowerPoint, creating a new slide in PowerPoint. That could be a skill level. And that, of course, gives you much more accurate results and very, very accurate learning recommendations. So that's like a very, very brief overview of assessment options.
There's also really, just to add one small thing, there's a really exciting field. So this was all direct assessment. There's a really exciting field of indirect skills inference as well. Really in the early stages in terms of technology still. But of course, you can also try using technology to infer skills people might have based on their behavior, based on documents they have been sharing, based on text, based on their CVs. Based on their behavior in Microsoft Excel or PowerPoint, right? So that's what you are actually experiencing in many web-based tools already today, that you get a personalized onboarding tour based on the behavior of the user, right? So most of the stuff is not market ready yet, but we expect in the next 5 years or so, really exciting field to see many indirect skill inference solutions as well to detect those skills, to not having to ask like 50 questions to the learner.
Anna Maria also has a question.
Yes. So let's imagine that we're buying the skill taxonomy, right? So we're buying it from somewhere. We double check to make sure that there are no very industry specific skills missing in the taxonomy. We add our flavor to it. I'm trying to understand what the next, how does the next step look like in real life? Because I imagine that each role will have a skill profile, kind of like that's the ideal profile for X role. And then each employee will have a skill profile. And the way to identify gaps at the company level is by analyzing all of the role skills that are needed and all of the real skills that we have. And then we have a gap here. And then based on our 5-year, 10-year strategy, etc., what strategically makes sense for us, we anticipate these skills to become more valuable, ergo more scarce, and this ones to die, ergo maybe we don't focus on them anymore since they're phasing out. So my question is, how does that mapping process look like for those roles? For people, I think you very much explained with the answer to the previous question, self-reported managers, etc. Like that doesn't make it easier. I think it's really behaviors, and something that I might think it's good might not be enough for you. So what is enough? What is good? What is excellent? That's a whole different ballgame. But I'm curious, what are you seeing when you're mapping out the skill set of the ideal role? Because my brain says, oh, you're doing kind of like a role analysis, but role analysis is based on a reality. How do we know what the ideal situation of that role looks like? Like who maps that? How does that look like in real life?
Yeah, excellent question. So usually in practice, so I can only experience from practice first of all, and then I say a little bit about the ideal state. But usually in practice, we are seeing, and this is also desired, that of course functional experts, so the subject matter experts or the actual role owners, are usually the first ones asked, and this is actually good. What do you think? How does your role evolve in the future? So what's needed today, and given what you're seeing in the field, because they are usually the experts, how does it look like tomorrow in certain sense? So this already in practice, and we are seeing this already gives you quite a good first draft of the future role itself. Now, the interesting thing starts when those people are not seeing certain developments yet that maybe the strategic level of the company is seeing, or maybe that you would be seeing if you would have more insights, for example, into also your competitors' skills or your industry skills, or what's moving others in the field. So really to expand your vision a bit broader towards other domains next to your own role and your own team and your own company even. And this is where usually for this ideal set, you would involve, first of all, a little more stakeholders, in particular, different other departments looking at role sets. And also then ultimately it's also affecting workforce planning, the number of roles needed in the future and so on. So usually depending on the size of an organization, then there's an entire team also joining you in this effort towards skills-based organizations. And then there are interesting solutions that you can use to inspire and inform all those people that look at skills in the industry that are needed in the future, both from a qualitative perspective, but also from a quantitative perspective, where you can, for example, do some web scraping on the job ads of your competitor, looking for and extracting skills they are currently looking for, looking at the workforce of the competitor, extracting skills based on the public data. That's also what we did in some projects in the past, which is really exciting. Not directly giving you exactly the future role that you need, because every company is special, but at least informing those people building the role. That's kind of the different perspectives that we usually take.
Thank you.
If there are still any more questions, right now would be a great moment. If not, we'll come to a close.
Thank you so much already, by the way, for the really interesting questions. That was really fun.
Thanks so much from our side, both not just for listening, but also for really productive work. Many great skill profiles. I would love to zoom into a little more, but unfortunately we're limited in time. If you come across any questions after the workshop, feel free to contact us. Is there a way, I think on the slides that we will also send over there are also our contact details. So, and you can also find us on LinkedIn, and I think you won't struggle with finding our contact details. So feel free to contact us with any question you might have. We are also running from time to time separate, more detailed masterclasses on the topic and so on. So if you're curious, just reach out.
We can do a bit of a recap afterwards. So if Klara and David, you would like us to share certain links or certain pointers or like anything you want to communicate, we can add that in the follow-up.
Perfect.
All right, and just like that, let's move out to the last question that we have open. We still have a few people here. What is one thing that you're taking away to experiment with from today's session? I know there might be a lot to experiment with there, but what would be one thing that you would like to take?
You can type the answers and then you have to click send in order for it to land on the other side of the poll. Also, it's confusing for some people.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Sounds good. See a few of them coming in. It arrived at the right time for the right people. Again, thank you so much, Klara and David, for the session. We will be in touch after the session together with Stephanie as well, and we'll get the video out for those that have been here today and that would still like to see and watch it later. Also get the contact details for Klara and David out there, and make sure that if you have any further questions about building a skill taxonomy, you can reach them.
Oh yeah, nice. Forgot about that.
For now, thank you all so much for joining, and we will catch you by the end of January with our next Talk Lab, and don't forget to check out Slack for any other events that we organize. And yeah, we'll catch you later. See you around.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
For the
Thanks for
organization.
organizing,
Thank you.
Stefan. Thank you both. It was awesome.